So, hello everybody. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the dark eye, das schwarze Auge, which is Germany's second oldest role-playing game, but probably its most successful one. And its story dates back to the early 80s. In the early 80s, in 1981, 1982, 1983, a trend was trying to sweep across the Atlantic into Europe, into Germany, and that trend into the non-English speaking parts of Europe, I should say. And that trend was role-playing games. And of course, the most famous one and the biggest and best-selling role-playing game at the time was Dungeons and Dragons. And there were a couple of people here in Germany, three, who went on to become the founders of what we know as TDE, and they got a hold of the Red Box. They had all different backgrounds. One of them was an arts teacher who spent some of his part-time and spare time translating fiction, especially fantasy, but also science fiction, into German. Someone else was also working as a literary agent, and he later on became the first agent for G.R.R. Martin, actually. And they basically fell in love with Dungeons and Dragons. And at the same time, and sometimes, these things cannot be made up because they sound like fiction, but they're actual reality. TSR was trying to get a foot into the German market. The German market at the time in what was West Germany had about 71 million inhabitants. Another 8 million or so lived in Austria. Then you have some German speakers in Switzerland. You have some German speakers maybe in Denmark. Some smaller countries also would have German speakers. So, while of course not every single person, infant to geriatric patient somewhere in end-of-life care, would be able and willing to play role-playing games, there were a lot of people who would make up an addressable market. So they decided that they wanted to enter the German market, and they were looking for someone to basically do the translation and open the door. At the same time, our three heroes, Alpers, Fuchs, and Kiso, who had fallen in love with Dungeons and Dragons, decided that they were going to try and convince TSR that they should be doing the translation and the publishing of Dungeons and Dragons in German. They had already founded a company that was reselling science fiction and fantasy literature, used science fiction, fantasy literature. They had also managed to become the agents for Avalon Hill Games, which they were selling across Germany. And so when they approached TSR at a German games trades fair, TSR became interested. And they said, okay, well, that sounds interesting. And at the same time, the three guys sat down and actually started translating the rules for the Red Box, as well as the first adventures. So they actually started to create content for Dungeons and Dragons for German without even having a contract. But they were saying, well, we want to convince them that this is what we can do and that's what we're really good at. And so they did this. At the same time, TSR had no idea how the German market worked. They didn't know anyone in the German market. They didn't know anyone in the German games industry, which even back then was an industry where lots of money could be made. But basically, Alpers, Kiso, and Fuchs said, we're going to do this. We're going to take care of this for you. And so a deal was going to be made between Drömer Knauer, which is a book publisher in Germany that was going to create the books, print the books and everything, and Schmidt Spiele, which at the time was one of the biggest German games companies. They were the publishers of the German version of Ludo, and they were making boatloads of money with games. And so a contract was being negotiated, but then TSR, according to some, became really greedy, and they wanted a lot of money in royalties without really actually providing more, in inverted commas, than the products, because they weren't going to take care of the translation. It was all going to be taken care of by the German partners, but they wanted a really, really big cut. And Schmidt Spiele said, no, we're not going to pay that. And so the contract fell through. And Schmidt Spiele was irate. And they said, okay, we're going to blow those guys out of the water. And so they came back to Alpers, Kiso, and Fuchs and said, you know what? Within the next couple of months, just in time for the next trades fair, so this was probably October 1983, you are going to create a German role-playing game, and we're going to publish this, and we are going to blow TSR out of the water. Because at that time, while the translation existed, TSR had no publisher, TSR had no one in the German market that was going to market Dungeons and Dragons. And that's exactly what happened. So the three guys sat down and they created their own new German RPG. They had already translated Tunnels and Trolls, and their company had been publishing Tunnels and Trolls in its German version. So, and of course, they had translated Dungeons and Dragons, or what was already available for Dungeons and Dragons at the time. So they had plenty of background knowledge. They were role players themselves, so they were the right people to do this. And some of them had also written, like articles, or even like Ulrich Kiso went on to write books, as did Alpers as well. And so they sat down and they created a role-playing game. Now the problem was, of course, that they had already translated D&D. So in order to ensure that they were not going to be held accountable with regard to plagiarism and stuff, whatever they wrote had to be very, very different. So the first thing that they did was they couldn't use the translations that they had created for the attributes in D&D. So they had to come up with new terms, which is why strength, for example, Stärke is Körperkraft, which some people consider a really weird German term. I don't, but apparently at the time people were wondering where this came from. But also, they had to find a different die rolling mechanic, because in D&D, back then as today, you roll over a value, and the higher you roll, the better your roll is, and if you roll a natural 20, that's a crit. So they came up with the idea of rolling under a value. So a little bit like Call of Cthulhu, where you also roll a percentile die and you have to roll under the target value, or you need to hit the target value in order to succeed. And the lower the roll, the better. So that was the first thing that they did. And so they created, within a couple of months, really not more than 10 weeks, a complete set of rule books and several adventures, 4 in total, that could be published the next year. And they were published the next year. And Schmidt Spiele, of course, was, as I said, a really big player in the German market. And they basically said to all companies, to all department stores, to all game shops, if you don't take TDE into your offering, and if you don't display it, and if you don't sell it, you will not be getting any of our other games. And of course, the department stores and all of the game stores needed Schmidt Spiele games, because those were the games that were selling at the time and still are selling today. So in a way, they basically put pressure on the German gaming stores saying, you have to take Das Schwarze Auge and you have to sell Das Schwarze Auge. They sent review copies to all and sundry. They even created film spots for TV advertising Das Schwarze Auge, which at the time was quite something. And especially for a game that didn't exist. So they were really pulling out all the stops and to ensure that Das Schwarze Auge was going to succeed. Of course, they were, their pride was hurt. So they were trying to get one over on TSR, and they managed to get one over on TSR because the first installment of the basic adventure box of TDE sold 100,000 times. That is a lot in RPG terms, especially when the total addressable market is, of course, a lot smaller than in the United States. I mean, like I said, there were probably going to be about 80 million German speakers who, in theory, could, or people who were born in Germany and lived in Germany, who could, in theory, buy it. But of course, infants are not going to buy it. Older people may not be buying it. So you're talking about every man, woman, and child in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and the Benelux countries might be able to read it and buy it. But of course, the addressable market is a lot less. So 100,000 units sold is incredible. And of course, that's something that you wouldn't reach today. And you don't reach this with D&D in Germany either. So TSR was a bit annoyed because, of course, their stuff was also being sold through the company of Fuchs, Alpers and Kiso at the time. And then they basically severed ties with them, saying, well, we don't want you to do any more translations for us. We don't want you to do anything else for us, because obviously there was now, on their end, a perceived and probably concrete conflict of interest. So they basically found a different publisher, but that didn't work out as well because first of all, Das Schwarze Auge existed and it was being marketed very aggressively, and it was being marketed by one of the biggest German companies in the area of games. And so D&D didn't really stand a chance in the beginning. And very soon after that, the next, if you like, iteration of TDE was created. The so-called Ausbauspiel. So we had the base game, and then we had the advanced game, as it were, which still looked like the original in many ways. So you roll one die and you roll under your score. However, as of the third edition, what we're used to today in TDE, namely rolling against 3 stats, became established and hasn't changed since. So nowadays, or as of the third version, the whole system looked very, very different from D&D, and there was simply no comparison anymore because the way the rules worked had been overhauled so much that the fact that it was created, if you like, as an answer or almost retaliation to D&D and TSR not playing ball in the German market, has become completely forgotten, and only very few people, of course, know this or knew this at the time. Today, it's common knowledge because today, obviously, all of these things are being talked about. But way back when, I'm pretty sure that nobody really knew what TSR was and nobody really cared what TSR was. And so this whole story of one company trying to get into the German market, demanding inordinate amounts of money for their intellectual property, and then being basically blown out of the water by a German company going, well, I'm not going to pay you this kind of money, and on the contrary, I'm going to create a game that is like your game, but it's much better. That's open for debate, but of course Schmidt-Spiele would have said so, and we're going to conquer the market in Germany with this game. Of course, the flip side to this is that TDE never really managed to make it outside of Europe. I mean, there are French versions, there are Dutch versions, etc. So in Europe, it did find a market, but it never managed to well, it did get some marketing in the United States, but of course it's nothing compared to the marketing efforts and the results that you gain here in Europe. So in the end, I think that the two versions are very, very different and they cater to different markets. But I would also say that when I look at it today, fifth edition, and all of the stuff that has happened in between, the two systems mechanically are different, but from the way the whole world is approached, they are eons apart. And for me personally, when it comes to the world that is built, the world, how it's being lived in, how it's being played in, TDE is basically the superior game because of its world building. I do understand those that say that it's quite complex with regard to the rules, but I would say this is true of very many games. And when you look at the different types of classes that you can have in a prestige class here and multi-classing there and so on and so forth, I wouldn't exactly say that D&D or Pathfinder for that matter are not complex. You can make them very, very complex. But I think today the two systems and the two worlds are so different that you can't really recognize the fact that one was born out of the other. And in order to, beat the other in a game of market forces. And that's a very, very short introduction to how TDE came into being and what its relationship to D&D is. And maybe I will talk a little bit more about the developments that happened later. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.